Well, welcome to our friends and colleagues and clients who are joining us from around the world today. I'm Brian Atkins, the president of Denison Consulting, and we appreciate your joining us for part 2 of our series on the role of culture in mergers and acquisitions. In part 2, we will hear the client perspective as shared by Angie Maninno, and in a moment I'll introduce you to her in a little greater detail. But first, let me just share a couple of administrative details as we get going here. The most important one being that on the right-hand side of your screen, for those of you attending, there's a place where you can type in questions for us. We certainly encourage you to do so, and we encourage you to do that throughout the presentation so that we can have some time to sort some of those questions out, see what kinds of questions might be in common so we can organize those. And my colleague at Denison, Alice Wastag, will be gathering those questions and organizing those, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as we can towards the end of our session here as time allows. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started here. Last month, I walked us through this model and shared a few insights about our work at various points in time during an M&A process, from the initial planning stages all the way through to the integration effort and then the ongoing cultural development of merged organizations. And so today we get to hear some insights about many of these stages, but from the client perspective, from someone who has led an organization through many of these stages. So I'd like to introduce you to Angie Maninno. Angie is the Senior Vice President of HR at Inova Health System in Northern Virginia. In a previous life, Angie was the Vice President of Culture and Change at Reynolds American, a company that was formed through the merger of R.J. Reynolds and Brown & Williamson. And I was fortunate enough to work closely with Angie and her colleagues as they brought these two organizations together. These were two organizations that had very long, rich histories, operating in, I guess what we could only describe as a fairly controversial industry. So I know you're going to enjoy listening to some of the insights that Angie has to share with us today. So welcome, Angie. And I started to set the stage here a little bit, but perhaps you could set just a little bit more context for today's discussion.
Thanks, Brian. And I would love to share some of the insights that I learned by going through this merger. Interestingly enough, the first part of the Denison merger and acquisition model talks about growth strategy. This is exactly how our merger began, with the desire to grow. The strategy of achieving significant growth through merger had been discussed by both companies for quite some time. Both companies knew that acquisition was probably the only way we were going to grow. Lots of pre-merger due diligence was being conducted, which fueled a lot of rumors about a possible merger. In fact, this had been the case for over 2 years. Finally, after years of speculation, the deal was closed on August 1st, 2004, which resulted in the combination of the number 2 and number 3 tobacco companies in the United States. This newly formed company would have sales of over $10 billion. In the months leading up to the close of the deal, we had developed a number of strategies, including the strategy for relocation of the Brown & Williamson corporate from Louisville, Kentucky to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and the manufacturing staff from Macon, Georgia to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I was an employee of Brown & Williamson, which meant that I was among those employees who had to relocate from Louisville, Kentucky to Winston-Salem and lead the cultural integration effort as well. We relocated approximately 1,500 people during the merger. It's important to note that we started thinking very early about the cultural integration and the need to focus on the creation of a single, aspirational, high-performance culture. We very much understood the risks associated with mergers and acquisitions, as both companies had experienced less than successful mergers in the past. Because of this, our CEO was very committed to managing the cultural integration process as effectively as possible. She demonstrated her commitment with the creation of my position, which was Vice President of Culture and Change, and I was dedicated solely to the cultural integration of the two companies. She also put her money where her mouth was, and she did this by committing the necessary resources to ensure that all of the culture change projects that we were going to undertake and the initiatives were all very well funded. The other thing that the CEO did, which I thought gave more emphasis and focus on the importance of the culture, was to speak about it often. Every opportunity that she had to address a group of employees, she would take this opportunity to talk about the importance of establishing a high-performance culture and how it was key to our success.
That's great. I think some of that additional context is helpful. It's always good to understand some of the history of the organizations, what some of their experiences before the merger took place, and then certainly some of what they were going through as the deal was moving forward. You mentioned the growth strategy, and last month during the first part of our webinar, we talked about how many merger and acquisition deals are done with a focus on the external marketplace. It's about entering new markets, acquiring new technologies. Specifically, what were some of the drivers for this merger between Reynolds and Brown & Williamson?
Brian, we had many external drivers, as you can imagine. In our business, the industry was declining. We had very little opportunity for organic growth. We were losing consumers not only due to the expected decline in consumption, but also due to new entrants in the U.S. market that were selling cigarettes much cheaper than we could sell them. We were also facing unyielding competition by Altria, who was aggressively discounting their flagship brand, Marlboro. These factors, combined with the lower margins due to our high overhead and infrastructure costs, led to the need to merge. Prior to the merger, both companies were in a state of decline and were either in the middle of, which was the case with RJR, or planning to, which was the case for Brown & Williamson. We were planning to conduct huge downsizings. We knew that the merger would not solve our inherent business problems. It would simply give us time to work through solutions. It gave us approximately 2 years. Our need to change was huge after the merger, as we were now on the clock, per se. What this did was accentuate our need to create strategies to grow our priority brands, stabilize our non-priority brands, and develop new innovative products. It also heightened the sense of urgency to look at ways to lower our cost structure and drive continuous productivity.
It's interesting that you note that simply combining the two companies would not, in and of itself, solve some of the legacy business problems that both businesses were experiencing. It would seem to me that there was a lot of pressure to try to achieve that 1 + 1 = 3 scenario that we often hear people talk about in the M&A world, and unfortunately is not always realized. You mentioned the desire very early in the M&A planning process to create that single high-performance culture. And I know when I think back, I remember that you reached out to us very early in that process as you were starting to think about the bringing of these organizations together. And so I was wondering if you could take just a moment to share a few thoughts about why you chose the Denison model for that process.
Sure. What we were looking for, and the reason that Denison was such a great fit, was that we needed a beacon for change or a guiding light. As I stated earlier, we have the external business case, but internally our employees felt that the merger solved all of our problems. They didn't see why we needed to change anything else. But we knew that we wanted to evolve our culture and that this was going to require some major undertakings, especially if we wanted to drive empowerment, change, team orientation, and also our core values. We also knew that we needed to make sure that our employees understood where we were heading and how we were going to get there. What the Denison model brought us was clarity on what was working, what was not working, and permission to enact the changes necessary. What we did was we shared the Denison results with our employees, and we used it as a benchmark to tell them, first, we heard you, and also benchmark the changes we were going to undertake. We told our employees we heard you and that we will address the areas where our scores are low based on the model. The beautiful thing about using the Denison model during our merger situation is that it provided a neutral roadmap and assisted in the prioritization of what needed to be addressed and when. It was not an RJR survey, nor was it a Brown & Williamson survey. We were trying very hard to take legacy names out of our nomenclature, so this was important to us. Denison was new for the company, and it was new for our new company. This gave it more credibility to employees and our leadership teams, as there was no legacy aspect to it. The Denison model also made sense to our employees, especially the analytical types who normally do not buy into the culture stuff, especially the soft side of culture. What they can relate to is the business performance link to culture that Denison provides. Intellectually, most people can understand that the levers inherent in the elements of, let's say, adaptability and mission would drive growth, or that the levers for involvement and consistency could drive operating performance or quality. They just need the connection that Denison creates for it to all make sense to them.
Sure, and you mentioned that having a guiding light or a neutral roadmap, I think, is one of the ways you described it, the neutral roadmap that the Denison model offered. I guess I'll just offer a quick note here in that it seems to be an important concept as you bring companies together, this notion of having a model or something that organizations can strive towards together. I know in their book, Joining Forces, our friends and colleagues, Mitch Marks and Phil Mervis, talk a little bit about the need for, or what happens is that some companies start to look too inward, basically, and then the focus becomes more on winners and losers versus what can we create together. And I guess a big part of what can make people start to feel like winners or losers in this kind of a situation is the degree to which they feel like they have to change versus the degree to which they believe that it's the others who are going to have to change. So last month I mentioned that the level of change that is needed for one organization or more coming together can vary depending on the level of integration desired, the dynamics of the merging organizations. I thought it would be interesting if you took a moment to just describe a little bit about the level of change that was needed for the Reynolds and Brown and Williamson folks.
Sure. We had an interesting dynamic at play with our merger that facilitated a significant level of change. That dynamic has been described as being a reverse merger. It's called that because the CEO of the combined companies was the former CEO of Brown and Williamson, which was the smaller of the two companies, the one that was being acquired. Even though Brown and Williamson was losing its corporate headquarters and many staff as well, the leadership of the combined organizations was being driven by Brown and Williamson. Initially, that created some concern for the RJR people, who may have initially thought that their world was not going to change all that much. But ultimately, though, this was a transformational merger for both companies, one that required significant change for everyone from both organizations. There were the obvious changes associated with relocations and the influx of employees into Winston-Salem, but there were also other very significant changes occurring or about to occur. We were going to introduce SAP. We had the relocation and integration of manufacturing facilities. We had new marketing strategies for brands from both companies. And we were going to introduce a series of continuous productivity improvement processes. So there was a lot of change for everyone involved in this.
Being around the organization at that time, I do recall that there was a lot of change going on, and I know we're going to discuss some of those changes in more detail as we go forward here during this presentation. One thing that I noticed in this process was that the early and frequent references to creating a single high-performance culture allowed you to introduce a wide range of initiatives, everything from improvements to the workplace environment to the formation of the integration teams to how we're going to handle pay for performance. You mentioned SAP and continuous productivity improvement. And all of those were kind of put out there within this context of the striving to create a single high-performance culture, which I thought did a really good job of taking culture out of that soft and fuzzy realm where it so often rests and placing it at the center of many of the hard business issues that you were trying to resolve as an organization. So on that note, I was impressed with the fact that when I first met you and your colleagues, you were already thinking about culture, and that was several months prior to the close of the deal. Can you share a few of the things that you were doing as part of the due diligence phase to prepare for the closing of the deal and the eventual integration that was about to take place?
Sure. The CEO of the newly created company was very much interested in culture and was concerned about the cultural issues that could arise. What we did during the due diligence phase was conduct a deep dive into the culture of both companies. We were looking for a cultural baseline that identified the similarities, the differences, the cultural drivers, and the points of contention for each individual culture, as well as gaps between the individual cultures and the aspirational culture we knew that we were going to build. We needed this for our change plan, and we didn't want any unplanned surprises. We accomplished this by interviewing all levels of employees at each company, and we asked them a series of questions to gain insight as to their perceptions of their own culture and how they perceive the culture of the other company. What we found was that even though we were both in the same industry and we were both mature, established companies, there were striking differences in the culture of the two companies. We were completely different in areas such as how we communicate, how transparent we are, how hierarchical we are, how we work cross-functionally, our leadership styles, our globalness, our use of technology, and most importantly, our adaptability to change. Now that was the bad news. The good news is that there was a healthy respect for each other as competitors, and there was a deep longing to be part of a winning team and a passion to do what it takes to win. This was a great finding.
Yeah, and I recall some of those early differences and some of the focus that was placed on that. And I also recall how quickly the leaders moved to create a common focus, something for the people to align themselves around and for the organizations to focus on once the deal was approved. Once the deal was approved, the integration efforts seemed to hit the ground running. I just recall there was a lot of activity, and certainly more than we're able to describe here today. But I'm sure there are some activities that are worth noting and sharing with our audience. When you think about the first few months after the deal was closed, what would you say were some of the critical activities that come to mind for you?
As you said, Brian, there was a lot of activity. However, when I think about some of the key things that we did early on, I think about things like alignment. Getting the senior leaders aligned. We did this through a series of leadership workshops, which I will speak about later in the presentation. But the thing to note is that alignment was very important to us. Another key element was mission. Developing a vision, our roadmap for the future, and the core values that would guide our behavior were critical elements. We also focused on involvement. We created culture teams consisting of employees at all levels to address a variety of issues, such as building belief in the company's vision, strategy, and roadmap, focusing on our consumers and brands, rewards and recognition that drive performance, changing our work environment to drive creativity, innovation, and engagement. Communication was also key, and to address this, we started all-hands meetings to bring employees together so that they could hear a common vision and strategy for the future. This was a first for Reynolds. Brown and Williamson had these in the past. We also created a comprehensive all-points communication strategy designed to touch all levels of the organization, irrespective of where you resided, corporate office, manufacturing facility, or out in the field. Lastly was employee voice. We conducted focus groups to assess the progress we were making with the integration and where we were falling short. We used the Denison model as the framework for the questions that we asked in those focus groups to bring the Denison language further into our company nomenclature and give our employees a voice.
Yeah, I think I think the good news is that more and more these days, as more organizations are paying more attention to the M&A work during the merger and acquisition process, I think those early stages of cultural integration are a time where there's a lot of activity going on. One of the things that we've noticed is that sometimes organizations will start out paying a lot of attention to culture, at least in those early days. And I've heard leaders say, okay, we've been at this for a month or two. Can we now check this off? Can we check the integration piece off? And there were a number of actions and activities that you used to keep the momentum going after the initial integration efforts of the first few months. And so I was wondering if you could also share with us a few thoughts about those activities as well.
As you stated, Brian, we had created some really good momentum in those early stages of the merger, and we certainly did not want to lose that. We also knew that there were many more changes on the horizon, so we had to keep pushing for greater alignment and integration. Some of the key activities that we engaged in as we moved forward included leadership development. One thing we did with this is we brought together leaders in a cross-functional format, and this included legacy RJR and legacy Brown & Williamson employees, and we provided more detailed education to these folks regarding what a high-performance culture is, as well as detailed training around the Denison model. We had them identify current areas of stress in the organization and develop plans for helping the company move forward. Our CEO met with every group at the end of their 2-day training to hear their concerns and ideas. I think that providing an environment where leaders from each organization could learn together was extremely well received and helped to develop personal relationships among the participants that they may have not developed on their own. It also helped us establish the expected leadership behaviors for these levels. We followed these sessions up with leadership development sessions, again in a 2-day format, that included the top leadership within each function. So this was a functional specific leadership class. Their specific sessions allowed them to focus on team dynamics and productivity while identifying the business needs of the function and formulating strategies and plans to fulfill them. Other things we worked on were the creation of an aligned performance management system, and this was complete with transparent goals and line of sight all the way up to the CEO. We aligned our comp and benefits program to reward company and individual performance. We created a leadership development program complete with required leadership competencies and rolled that out. We launched a new employee directory system, which was an online employee directory with pictures and locations of employees, and it had a robust querying engine. What this did is assisted employees in navigating the new company. It was also used as a social networking type of site, so it helped you identify people and get to know each other a little better. The one thing, though, I will say that we did over and over was to consistently communicate our visions and strategies, which we coined our roadmap. And we emphasized the importance of a high-performance culture every time that we were in front of employees and in every single communication.
Yeah, listening to you now describe some of those key activities there, a few of the things that stuck out in my mind. I mean, first is the word alignment. It just seems to me like there was a lot of energy in creating alignment within the organization and an alignment towards the future. You mentioned the performance management system where there were transparent goals. I was really impressed with the fact that the CEO and all of the senior level executives were willing to put their goals for the next 6 months to a year out there in a way that every employee throughout the organization could access those, look at those, and have conversations with their bosses, supervisors, superiors about their own goals and how their goals aligned with where the leadership said the organization was going. I thought that was really important. I thought some of the leadership passages work that you talked about in terms of just creating some common language around leadership, what leadership skills and capabilities and behaviors are expected depending on where people sit in the organization was also pretty powerful. And again, it just reminded me how much energy was put into creating this alignment among the workforce. Another activity that you used to assess the degree to which you were creating this one company and to measure the effectiveness of the integration efforts was when you did administer the Denison Culture Survey. The results reflect many of the areas of focus of the integration effort, particularly in those initial merger stages, so things like vision, strategy, setting goals, having clear core values, people teaming together. Perhaps you can say a few words about the results and maybe start with a comment or two about just the timing of when you did the survey.
Sure, I'll talk about the timing of the survey. Initially, we thought we might collect survey data as the organizations came together, kind of use it as a baseline. But what happened is we recognized that immediately following the close of the deal, we were throwing the organization into a complete state of flux. We were shutting down the Brown & Williamson headquarters. We were eliminating positions. We were relocating people. There was just a lot of upheaval. So we made the decision to use the Denison model as a framework for how we brought the organizations together, but decided that we would wait until some of the dust settled before conducting the full assessment. We also had a concern as we had not yet fully flushed out our vision and strategies and felt that we needed to give employees guidance on where we were heading. We did not have this yet, as we were bound by confidentiality agreements pre-merger, and these prohibited us from creating any firm strategies until the close of the merger. When we did conduct the survey, we were generally pleased with what we saw. I will say that the significant effort that we had put into things like the roadmap, which I said before was our vision and strategies, our core values, and building teams was reflected in the findings, as you can see on this chart, which reflects the first Denison survey that we conducted. This result gave us the permission and the wherewithal to begin to focus on the areas where we knew improvement was needed, such as change and empowerment. This was a wonderful way to give our employees a beacon as to what we would be focusing on and why we were changing the things that we changed.
Yeah, you talked there about the timing of this, and particularly mentioned waiting for the dust to settle a little bit. And one of the questions we often get is a timing question. When's the appropriate time to do a cultural assessment, a survey? And it really depends on a number of factors. Obviously, if you can get some data on the organizations before they're coming together, then that data can be used to help facilitate some of the integration effort. As you noted, your ability to have conversations and do some of the pre-planning stuff was very limited. And as you also noted, day one, there were so many significant changes going on in that organization, with facilities shutting down, people being relocated, et cetera. We often say that the dust never really settles in organizations anymore, but in this case, in those first few months, you certainly did kick up a lot of dust, and I think it did make sense in the long run to use the model as a framework to guide your integration efforts, but do the assessment a little bit further down the road. And certainly the survey results were impressive. I mean, when I saw the results for the first time, my takeaway was that employees knew where the organization was trying to go. They felt involved. They felt like they were being kept in the loop as things were moving forward. They had values to guide their behavior. We always say that getting strong survey results is good, but that what's really important is that the organization is performing. And so it was certainly gratifying to us as we watched the combined companies meet and exceed many of your expectations. I'm sure it was especially gratifying for all of you who were putting so much of your energy into this effort. What were some of your reactions as you reflected on the progress that you had made at this point?
Well, I will tell you, we were very pleased with our business results. I mean, who can argue that a stock price increase from $57 a share to $115 a share is not a terrific accomplishment? On top of that, we also exceeded all financial targets set for this merger. So it was a win all the way around from a financial and business perspective. But although we had some terrific preliminary results, we knew that the merger only bought us a few years. So we needed to continue to drive high performance, productivity, employee engagement, and innovation. We never took our foot off the accelerator. What we did was begin to celebrate our successes and strive for more. We did things like we had an all-employee picnic to celebrate the successful first year of the merger. We had champagne toasts when we hit certain milestones. We had quarterly celebrations to acknowledge the momentum that we were creating. But the important thing with having some successes is not to rest on your laurels and stop your focus on culture, which is what a lot of companies do. In order to sustain it, it requires constant attention and nurturing. This means continued stretch goals, focus on the business, and acknowledgement and celebration of success. The foundation was laid with Reynolds, and I'm pleased to report that they have not had to negatively adjust their dividend, even through these tough economic times.
I recall being a part of some of the celebrations along the way as specific milestones and key business objectives were accomplished, and I recall how excited employees were along that path. As you had mentioned back at the beginning of the presentation, these were two organizations that had come through some rather difficult times in terms of reorganizations, downsizings, some pretty significant impacts to the business. And so it was really quite nice to see people in a position where they could celebrate some wins and feel good about some of their accomplishments. I talked a little bit earlier about the importance of trying to sustain the integration efforts beyond just those early days of cultural integration. After you collected your culture data, which again was about 9 months after the deal had closed, you kept the focus on working together on this path of high performance by identifying a couple of areas that you wanted everyone, regardless of where they sat in the organization, to focus on. You also allowed the various functions, groups such as operations, HR, finance, marketing, sales, to look at their own subset of data, their own cultural profiles, if you will, and create some actions that would help them address any of their unique cultural issues. And that was also an interesting process, and I was hoping you could say a few words about how that played out.
Sure. As leaders in the organization, we knew that there was much more change coming, and we knew that we needed the support and input of everyone as we streamlined our business and asked them to do more with less. Because of this, we chose creating change and empowerment as the two cultural areas that we wanted everyone to focus on improving. In addition, we wanted each function to look at their culture data and select one or two areas that may warrant focus based on their functional results. Now, they didn't have to add areas if there was no need, but if they saw something that they should focus directly on as a function, we asked them to seek those out. Each function went off-site, and this was part of, when I say off-site, this was part of the within-function off-site that each function participated in as part of their leadership development training. And I had referenced this earlier, these training classes. Well, anyway, they went off-site and created a functional engagement plan, which had to include their action plan for making progress in the areas of change and empowerment, as well as their unique focus areas. Those plans then had to be presented back to our Culture Steering Committee, which included myself, our CEO, and several other members of the leadership team. What this did is this allowed us to understand the efforts being taken, look for overlap in plans where we might be able to help maximize actions, and to share creative ideas among the various functions. We also provided over 800 leaders and managers with 360 feedback in the target areas of creating change and empowerment, so that the leaders at every level could see how they were perceived in these high priority areas, and so that they could create individual development plans for progress. This let the employees know that we were very serious about this in a very real way.
You know, I was thinking about, well, first of all, I guess I would agree that you and your colleagues were quite serious about the entire cultural integration effort. And I was thinking about how so often our clients find themselves in these situations where they're bringing new organizations together, and how easy it is for them to sort of take their eye off the cultural ball, if you will, and get so focused on what they perceive to be the core business issues, only to later find out that they've overlooked some pretty important aspects of the integration as they've done it. It's amazing to me to think back about in that first 12, 15 months of the integration effort, being able to train all of the top leaders, having offsites with all of the different functional groups, as you noted, training 800 leaders and giving them some 360 feedback, making improvements to the workplace, introducing SAP, introducing continuous productivity improvement, relocating 1,500 employees. I mean, when you think about the amount of activity that was going in there, and at the same time being able to keep focus on, and as you said, even the accelerator on the cultural piece of that, again, was just amazing to see how that played out and to generate the kind of business results that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So as I mentioned earlier, I was impressed at every step in the process with the thoughtful and methodical way that you and your colleagues approached the integration effort. And in fact, in presentations that I've done since then, I often will describe the work that you and your colleagues did as the closest thing I have seen to a textbook M&A integration process, if there is any such thing as a textbook process for what always is a relatively messy situation. And I know it's really difficult, I guess impossible for us to fully explore the range of activities that went into this process. We do have a case study that summarizes and talks about some of what we've talked about here that I know we can make available to the folks listening in today. And I'm sure that our attendees also have some questions that they'd like to get your reactions to. So as we conclude the presentation piece of today's webinar, I'd just like to ask you, Angie, to share any final insights or lessons learned, and then we'll get to some of the questions that have been brought in.
Sure, Brian, and thank you for the compliments. I do appreciate that. As I reflect back, if I had to sum up the most important aspects and plans, it would probably be to focus on the communication of the newly formed company's vision. What I've learned is that employees really need to know where the company is heading. They also need to see the leadership commitment to not just the culture, but to the success of the company overall. The reason that this is so important is that it gives employees critical information to assist them in deciding if they want to opt into this new thing or if they want to opt out of it. What you don't want are disengaged employees trying to figure out if they buy into this new thing, slowing the company's progress. This is also a great place to start to build excitement about the possibilities for those that opt in, and this helps with both managing ambiguity and it helps increase morale because people know where you're headed then. The other thing that is important is the ability and the mindset to adjust. As you just mentioned, there is no cookie-cutter merger acquisition process. What I mean about being able to adjust is that you can plan to the 9th degree, and such is life, things are going to change. I think having flexible culture change plans and the ability to course correct as needed is essential. Not all things work in every company. There is no magic formula, as I stated before, for culture change, so flexibility and experimentation are key. The last thing, that if I could impart one last thing to you, that is to celebrate milestones and successes. Nothing feels better to employees than to set a stretch goal, achieve it, and get recognition for it. This is true whether it's a personal goal or a shared goal. Celebrations and recognition are important.
Yeah, I think your point about being able to adjust and be flexible, I think, is obviously a critical capability that organizations need at all times, and certainly throughout that process it was necessary for the organization, because it's easy, I think, for you or I to kind of sit back in hindsight and say, well, here's this multi-month, year-and-a-half type process that we went through to bring these organizations together. I think it's also important to remember that at the time we were kind of taking it in stages. We do something for the first 90 days, and then we think about the next 120 days, and then the next 6 months, and adjusting as we went through that. So I really appreciate these insights. And at this point, I'd like to bring Alice Wastag from Denison into our conversation and ask Alice if we have some specific questions that have come in for Angie that she can respond to.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Angie, for that presentation. I think it was very insightful to hear the client perspective on mergers and acquisitions. We did have several questions come in, and the first few that I'm going to go over have to do with the employees. So, Angie, you talked about the importance of getting employees aligned around the roadmap and values. Could you share a few examples of what you did to communicate and reinforce those with the workplace?
Oh, definitely. As I've stated over and over in my presentation, communication was one of our primary strategies, and it was something that we strived to do very well with employees because we really wanted to embed our message. To enhance communication and the employee understanding of our roadmap specifically, what we did is we communicated it everywhere. It was on our employee portal. We talked about it at all hands meetings. We talked about it at quarterly review meetings. We had town hall style meetings with different levels of the organization where we talked about it. We put it in every employee publication, if we had newsletters, newspapers, that type of stuff. We even put it in the elevator speeches delivered by our executives. We got so far as where we wanted to communicate this that we created a physical rendition of our roadmap, and it looked like a roadmap, and it featured the key elements of the things that would make us successful, our milestones and goals. And we had one installed at each location, at each of our physical locations. And what we did is we used this to, again, communicate our roadmap, but it also was a physical demonstration of the progress as it occurred. So for example, on our roadmap, if we were trying to hit a share target at a certain point in time, as soon as we hit that share target, we referenced that on our roadmap. So this was, like I said, it was a good physical reference of where we were headed. In our performance appraisals, each employee was required to establish goals that linked to the elements of our roadmap. So these goals helped establish the line of sight, and it further drove understanding. It was especially helpful in showing our employees how they contributed to the success of the company. And lastly, speaking of the performance appraisal, one thing that we also did was emphasize the importance of following our core values. We felt that adherence to these were an important part of our roadmap because we didn't just want results. We cared about how employees achieve them. So to drive this, we had our core values placed on each employee's performance appraisal, as well as having them prominently displayed everywhere.
And in this integration or in this merger, can you think of any cultural missteps that can occur that might lose the support and engagement of the employees?
There's a lot of them. I think what you need to do is you need to make sure you do your due diligence and you understand the culture cues of each company. And I have an example of something that was a misstep on our part. And it's going to sound really trivial, but it did set us back a little bit. We were trying really, really hard to take legacy out of our nomenclature. We made it very taboo and inappropriate to talk about what legacy company you came from, because if you were in the building and you were part of Reynolds American, the new company, and so we worked really hard to establish this. One thing that we did is when we launched our core values, we had security cards that people carried with them to gain access to the building. We gave them security card size copies of our core values, so that the premise was that they would have them with them at all times. And then we gave them chains to put their security card on and have their core values. So if you want to put a chain around your neck and have your security card, you could have that. Where we miscued on this is at Legacy Reynolds, they didn't use their security cards for anything other than to access their parking garage. So once they got into the building, they put their badges away. They didn't carry them around with them. They didn't use them as name badges. You never saw them again. At Brown & Williamson, our badges were used to access everything in the building. All the security doors, you had to swipe your badge, so you had to have it prominently displayed. What it did is when we gave these cards out and the lanyards, it segregated the pack, because the B&W folks started showing their badges and carrying them around with them in a public manner. The Reynolds folks didn't, because that wasn't part of their culture. And what it did is it made people reference each other as a badge holder. You're a person that shows your badge versus you're somebody who does not. So it just put a little kink in our unification. I say this because you really need to think through everything you do from the lens of what would the legacy of company have done, and is this truly something new and innovative and something the new company would do that doesn't remind you of legacy.
Yeah, it's really amazing how you have to think about all of those little things and how something like that can become a much bigger issue.
Oh, sure.
You talked a lot about communication in the presentation, and you just referenced communication in your first answer today. Do you remember having any challenges with communication when it came to unions and communicating with the employees?
We've had 3 union campaigns at Reynolds, and our challenge was more in the union avoidance arena, where we had to train our employees on things that you can address and the proper way to address employees when you're under a union threat. So the challenge there was more from an educational perspective, to train our supervisors and managers on how you deal with this, how you address the issues, and how you engage your employees. So it was more from that perspective. We are not unionized. Reynolds is not unionized. Brown & Williamson was unionized, and the union went away when we merged. So in regards to actually dealing directly with the union, we didn't have that during the merger, because all of that was solved after we announced the merger.
Okay.
If that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that helps. So those were the questions on the employees, and we did have a question about the CEO. You had mentioned that the CEO had attended some of the training, that the CEO was addressing employees whenever possible about this merger and integration. Can you describe other ways that the CEO demonstrated her commitment to the integration effort?
Oh, sure. When we had focus groups, and it didn't matter what the focus group was for, if it was related to the culture integration or anything that had to do with the success of the company, our CEO would meet with the groups. What she would do is look at what the output was. She would meet with the groups, tell them what she heard to make sure that she understood what the issue was or what the concerns were, and then what she planned to do with it. And she would do this and emphasize our vision and roadmap and need for communication and that type of stuff. So she was heavily involved on that arena. She also sat on most of the committees that employees were required to report out to. As I referenced in my presentation, we had cultural steering committees that people, as they created their engagement plans to address the Denison survey results, she sat on that committee, but she also sat on other committees that dealt with all variety of things that go on in a merger and acquisition situation. So what she did is she kind of walked the talk, and she was very engaged and involved in it. She was also very visible, which I think is important. She was visible to employees during the integration, after the integration, and she's always been a very visible CEO. But what she did is she made her presence known. She ate in the lunchroom. She attended her direct reports staff meetings. She attended training that was offered to all employees. She had a rule that if you had a meeting with her, you had to book it in your office, because what this did is gave her an opportunity to walk the floors and to be out, amongst the employees, because she was on her way to something. This is much better for managers than this just go wander and walk the floors without a reason for being there. This gave her a reason to be where she was, talk to people, spread her message with a destination point. So she was very much involved in everything.
And before we jump into the next question, I just thought I'd add a little bit to that because, again, being involved in helping in this process, I mean, that was one of the things that really struck me. I know people often ask the question, can you make significant change efforts work in organizations when you don't have the support of senior leadership? And my response is typically, yes, you can. And it can be so much more quick, easy, effective if you have that strong leadership support. And so one of the things I just recall throughout that experience was every time we had an initiative going on, whether it was focus groups or some kind of a training event, some kind of an all-hands meeting, any place where we were going to be talking about culture, I just recall the CEO saying to me, what role can I play in this? How do you want me to support this? And lend as much credibility and support to this process as I possibly can. And that that kind of support and buy-in is just really difficult to overestimate, I guess, how valuable that can be.
Oh, I totally agree.
So Angie, for the next question here, the culture survey was not done until 9 months post-merger, and that probably had a lot to do with due diligence and a lot going on initially. But can you comment about how you were able to come up with a strategy for the change effort early on without having that cultural data at hand?
Well, what we did, we followed a real basic culture change plan. We relied heavily on Denison because it's a good model of the things that you need to address. It was a little bit of guessing, and it was a lot of, we did research on the internet. We could talk to employees from a cultural perspective. What we could not talk to them about were brand strategies, engagement strategies, things that would impact the performance of the business. So we were able to get some stuff done. But what we did is we went down the path and said, if we had the ideal organization and you take legacy out of the equation, what would Reynolds American look like? And we kind of greenfielded it and took a greenfield approach, which actually helped us because we didn't understand the legacy stuff as intimately as you would if you could talk to each other. So that kind of broadened our horizons and allowed us to make this much better, more progressive, more neutral company.
And Angie, did you have post-integration teams that had goals for those first 90 days, or did you have maybe a different timeline for those teams?
We did. We had integration teams, as you can imagine, covering everything post-merger. And what we did is we met weekly. We had integration meetings, and you had milestones that were benchmarked against weekly accomplishments and then monthly, and then we had 30, 60, 90 days, and then we looked out over the course of years. The reason we have the annual horizon is because of the manufacturing integration. It takes a lot to move factories and move production and that type of stuff. So we had everything from 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 3 months. We ran the gamut. But what we did is we kept the emphasis, focus, and pressure on it to make sure that people were meeting their milestones and that we were progressing. I think a mistake a lot of companies, especially a lot of companies I've spoken to, what happens is once they get production situated or the marketing piece situated, after 30, 60 days, they stop the process and they just kind of let things fall where they may. I think you need to keep the process on until the merger is absolutely complete.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any examples of how you address the beliefs and assumptions, that middle part of the model, directly when it came to things like differences and conflicts?
What we did, and again, I reflect back to the fact that we could not strategize prior to the merger, we were taking this greenfield approach and creating the ideal company. So we said, what does Reynolds American look like if you were to have a startup operation today? Well, we took that into the decision making, and this helped avoid a lot of conflict, because what we said is we're going to take the best. It may be a legacy thing. It may be something newly created. But what we're going to do is we're going to make the decision based on what's best for this new company. And what you got to let go of is how we did it before, because both companies, the other thing that we had as ammunition is both companies weren't doing so well before the merger. So we could go back and say that way wasn't working. Let's make the decision based on what's new. And so this helps solve a lot of those issues that you traditionally see in mergers with people not agreeing on how to move forward.
Yeah, and again, I'll just weigh in for just a moment here to that topic around sort of beliefs and assumptions, if you will. I mean, at least it was my perspective, and Angie, certainly weigh in if you think I misrepresent this in any way, but it was my perspective that, as Angie described, both organizations had been struggling a bit as they were coming together. So I think there were some underlying beliefs and assumptions that we're in a business that is in a downward spiral, and I wouldn't say hopeless, but certainly people feeling a little bit despondent about that. And so initially trying to change those beliefs and assumptions to being one of we can be a winning company, we can win back some market share, we can make some great strides in the marketplace. My sense was people were kind of on the fence a little bit, and yet the fact that the leaders were out there every day putting the messages out there, very clear strategies for how they expected to get there, and then celebrating and recognizing the accomplishments every step of the way helped to change those beliefs and assumptions and that mindset of the workforce in a relatively, from my perspective, a relatively brief period of time. I'm talking probably 6 months, 9 months.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you, Angie. We do have one more question before we wrap this up. The final question has to do with how long did it take you before you could say, this is starting to work, we're starting to act like one organization, and we're starting to behave like one company? Or was it something that was just very gradual and you didn't really have a moment where that was a realization for you?
Well, to be honest, it was all a blur until about the 9-month mark. We had so much activity and things that we were trying to accomplish that it was hard to raise up for air. But what my gut feeling when you just said this was about the 9-month mark. For some reason, right around that time, things just began to feel different in the company. You know, people stopped referencing their legacy companies. Our logo, we had a new logo for Reynolds American, so that was starting to be embedded, so you rarely saw legacy company logos. People started to look familiar, so you go to meetings and people didn't look new anymore. People had learned how to navigate around the company, you know, where to park, where the meeting rooms are, who the players were, who the department heads were. The other thing is people were talking in the same language at that point. So the acronyms no longer seemed foreign to each other, and we had some unification in, you know, our speak, our language. We had already had the aligned goals and leadership expectation. In regards to this 9 months, I remember a pivotal part of the merger was a board meeting that we had. And this was a board meeting with the officer level employees in our board. They always had a social aspect of it where we all went to dinner, had cocktails or whatever, and it was just to help the board members get to know the people who were running the company. A board member came up to me and asked me about a few individuals, had pointed across the room and said, what company did they come over with? And it just struck me that at that point in the merger, nobody knew who was legacy. And that's when I thought, you know, this is working. We're coming together, we're forgetting who's legacy, and we really are marching forward, you know, to this new Reynolds American thing. So I think that was it. I think it was about the 9-month point. I really thought it would it was working then.
That's great. And that, I believe you said, Alice, was the last question we had time for, right?
That is the last one, yes.
All right, great. Well, you know, again, I want to thank Angie for one more time, you know, reliving this M&A journey that we were so fortunate to be able to experience together, and sharing, you know, a lot of, I think, really good insights and perspective. Again, we appreciate your time in doing that. And I also want to thank all of those people who listened in and participated with us today. We know, again, that people's time is extremely valuable these days, so we appreciate your taking an hour out of your day to listen in, and hopefully found it to be extremely worthwhile. As we close here, I'll just mention that we will continue our webinar series again next month. We have a presentation on Moving New York City, Culture Change at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, that's going to be presented by one of our colleagues, a gentleman named Brian Glazer, who works with a group called Gotham Culture Consulting Group based in New York City, and Lorianne Hoffman, who works for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority. So they're going to be sharing some insights next month about some of their culture change efforts, and we hope that you'll take the time to join us once again. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it.